is our third joint meeting with the United States Institute of Peace project. Today's meeting is on the Arab uprisings and mass politics, possibilities, constraints, and uncertainty. The author is Laurie Brand, and you can pick up a copy of the paper on your way out. We are going, just before the session is over, we will put a stack of these paper on the table outside. Laurie Brand is the Robert Grandford Wright Professor and Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California, where she served as Director of the Center for International Studies from 1997 to 2000 and Director of the School of International Relations from 2006 to 2009. She's a past president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and she is an accomplished author. She is the author of The Palestinians in the Arab World, Institution Building and the Search of State, Jordan's Inter-Arab Relations, The Political Economy of Alliance Making. You have her bio, so I'm just going to stop there. I would like to extend to her a special welcome because this is her first time at the Wilson Center and the first time as a speaker in our program. So I hope this is going to be the beginning of a series of your appearances here. To my right is our partner at USIP, Stephen Heidemann, who serves as Senior Advisor for Middle East Initiative at the United States Institute of Peace. Steve is a political scientist who specializes in the comparative politics and the political economy of the Middle East, with a particular focus on Syria. You have his bio. I'm going to stop here, but I must say we are delighted that he's here and not in Syria. So, because it was very, exactly, so we share this the pleasure together. Laurie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Hale. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I always enjoy coming back to Washington. I was an undergrad here and then worked, so I've spent about 8 years of my life in D.C. Always happy to have the opportunity to come back. And also a great pleasure to be on a panel with Steve, a colleague of long standing. I want to start off with a short anecdote. I was reviewing some of the things that came out of the Arab Summit in Doha, and there was one report of, during the speech that Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi gave, that a number of Jordanian participants were seen to be clapping. And this seemed a bit odd. On further examination, it turned out that rather than focusing on the Egyptian president's speech, they were instead following the news of the Jordanian-Japanese soccer match, which was, this is part of the World Cup qualifying process. So it seems to me that there are several lessons in that short anecdote. One is to expect the unexpected, Jordan beating Japan. Secondly, that things are not always what they seem. The Jordanians were clearly not clapping for Morsi. And also always be open to alternative explanations for the phenomena that you observe. And I think that's good advice for following Middle East politics, I think probably politics in general. To turn to today's subject, the political developments of what I'll call post-2010, I don't like the term Arab Spring particularly, are unprecedented, I think, in their depth and their breadth. I think it's important, though, to remember that during the period 1987 and 1989, there were also a number of dramatic episodes in the region, which also led, I think, to some rearranging of strategic architecture. There was the Palestinian Intifada. There was the Algerian Uprising of 1988, which did away with the one-party system. And then there were the Jordanian riots of 1989, which I would argue did more to introduce some elements of reform in that system than anything we've seen that Abdullah has introduced since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring. But today, of course, there are a different set of circumstances, different set of constraints under which leaderships are operating, opportunities as well as constraints in play. The United States is now the sole superpower, which was not the case in 1987 to 89, although the drawn-out engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq certainly have somewhat, I think, weakened U.S. power in the region. Russia continues to seek influence, and if you may have noticed, Bashar al-Assad appealed to the BRICS the other day for support for his continuation in power, so Russia remains an important player, if not on the level of the United States. On the economic front, neoliberal orthodoxy has certainly shown its limits. It's one of the reasons why we have these uprisings in the region over the last few years. But there's been no new approach formulated or proposed to address the results of decades of economic distress. And indeed, if one looks at the Islamists' program for the economy, certainly in Egypt and in Tunisia, there's nothing sort of non-neoliberal about it. They seem to be embracing the same sort of approach. Also important, I think, for analyzing the changing security environment is the fact that this time around we have the simultaneous occurrence of multiple revolts. And so I think that introduces an element of sort of unprecedented uncertainty into this region where alliance structures and I think power balances had already been shaken, first by the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003 and the resultant rise in Iranian power. So with that as a bit of background, let me say something about this broader popular participation, because my task today was to talk about the role of what's been called mass politics and the influence that it might have or that it does have or doesn't have in the way that regional relations as well as extra-regional relations are unfolding. If we look at certainly the Tunisian and the Egyptian cases, the youth and members of long-suppressed labor unions were the most important foot soldiers in those revolutions. But those who made the revolutions have clearly not been the ones to then lead them forward. We've had a lack of recognized or charismatic leadership. I think that's striking. And that, I think, has contributed to the fractionalization after what was an initial revolutionary drive. In some cases, Egypt most notably, I think the revolutionaries just eschewed efforts at political institutionalization. But in some cases, they were also outmaneuvered by better organized competitors. But as a result, the new leaders are not young idealists with fresh perspectives. Instead, what we have are men, overwhelmingly, who were in exile, who were suppressed or co-opted by previous regimes, and none of whom can claim what I would call is traditional revolutionary legitimacy, regardless of what they may say now. If we turn to elections that have taken place since the beginning of these uprisings or revolts, the first parliamentary elections in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya all attracted a great deal of popular enthusiasm, important turnouts, significant turnouts. In subsequent rounds, at least in Egypt, there's been a decline in voting to a certain extent. I mean, Egypt has witnessed voting for two referenda, parliamentary elections, which were in 3 stages, presidential elections in 2 stages. So it was to a certain degree, I think it's just a degree of election overload. But there's also, I think, a sense that people are tired. They want movement forward, and they're concerned that this kind of participation is not bringing it to them. In any case, I think in general what we see are periodic renewals of demonstrations, in some cases violence. We saw in Boursaid earlier this month or late last month. And this violence, I think, indicates a gap, in some cases a growing gap, between the new leadership and the people, the masses involved in politics. But if we turn to the relationship between mass politics and foreign policy, which is what I'm really supposed to focus on today, the early mobilizations, I mean, in early mobilizations, if one looks at the slogans, at some of the signs that were being carried, clearly there were demonstrations, manifestations of what you could call pan-Arab solidarity, concerns with some broader pan-Arab issues, Palestine in particular. But the subsequent mobilizations, I think, really have been overwhelming around domestic issues, issues of economic disenfranchisement, unemployment, corruption, concerns with the security state, the role of the military, and so on. So at least when we look at extra-regional relations in foreign policy, I think there's been a striking degree of continuity. Within the region itself, we've had some some shifting of axes, and I'll talk about that a bit. In order to do this, and I was told that I had 15 to 20 minutes today, so that's one of the reasons I'm talking fast. I probably already may have an extra 5. Okay, I was fine yeah. I mean, I do my best to try and keep to the time limit. But what I've decided to do is focus on 2 key cases that I see at sort of opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the amount of change, or the depth of change that has taken place. And there are also countries which are extremely important for U.S. policy in the region. And in this case, I'm talking primarily about U.S. concern with the peace treaty with Israel and with longstanding military relationships. So I want to talk about Egypt briefly first, and then I'll turn to Jordan. And obviously in Q&A, I'm happy to explore any of these in greater detail. So turning first to Egypt, with the demise of Hosni Mubarak, this sort of certainly augured for a marked shift, or potentially marked shift, in Egypt's relations with Gaza, with Hamas, and with the Palestinian Authority, because Mubarak's Egypt was a key part of this U.S., Israel, Jordan, Palestinian Authority axis, a fierce opponent of Hamas, an enforcer of the siege of Gaza. So when, with Morsi's running in presidential elections in Egypt, and then with his victory, certainly there was some concern about what this might mean, given past Muslim Brotherhood positions and statements made by various leaders, what this might mean for the peace treaty. But Morsi and the Brotherhood in general quickly reassured the United States that that Egypt would uphold its international commitments, including the peace treaty with Israel. And there's nothing that's happened since then that has really shaken that. And I think that if one looks at the constraints under which Morsi is operating, it's not at all surprising. You have a civilian leadership which is still in the process of trying to consolidate itself. It's still facing challenges from a variety of fronts. And it has, in order to try and reinforce its position, established what I might call a marriage of convenience, or perhaps uncomfortable marriage of convenience, with the Egyptian military. And that was manifest clearly in several of the articles in the new constitution, which continue to provide for lack of transparency in particularly in the funding of various aspects of the Egyptian military. These are things which the revolutionaries would have wanted abolished, or wouldn't have wanted to see in a new constitution. So given the Egyptian military's longstanding close relationship with the United States, most notably the $1.3 billion in aid that it receives annually, given the role that the United States plays in the IMF, as well as a number of other international multilateral lending institutions, during a period when Egypt is desperately seeking financial assistance and loans, it would be very difficult to have imagined Egypt taking a position that would have significantly alienated or risked alienating Washington, regardless of what a popular constituency might have called for. And I certainly haven't seen massive outpouring of popular sentiment for major changes along these fronts. So we have a continuing strong military relationship with the United States, and that seems above question, at least from the Cairo side. And I know there's some in Congress who raised the question about whether there should be some alterations. The joint military training operation Bright Star, which was not held in 2011, is scheduled to be held this year. When Morsi dismissed the head of the SCAF, Mohamed Tantawi, replaced, and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took over, the relationship really didn't skip a beat. The Americans know all these guys. They're very familiar with the upper level of the Egyptian military. So U.S. military aid has continued. We continue to have overflight rights, priority passage through Suez, and so on. So, and Sisi has recently praised growing U.S.-Egyptian military cooperation. Now, there was some discussion about revisions in the treaty, in the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and they were echoed by civil society, but they had to do with the importance, as Egyptians see it, of Egypt asserting somewhat greater sovereignty in the Sinai. And this had to do with confronting the security challenge that Egypt sees as emanating from the Sinai Peninsula. The peace treaty did not give Egypt full sovereignty over it. The Mubarak regime did not seek to integrate the Sinai fully economically. Land ownership there has basically been the prerogative of the military. All this is to say that this is an area that suffers from a number of key economic and security problems, which have both contributed to, and then in the result of, we have arms smuggling, other sorts of trafficking, as key economic activities. We have the growing influence of some radical elements who've attacked military and police stations. So I think if one looks at the challenge in Sinai and the response in Sinai, as well as the challenge of Gaza and the Morsi government's unfolding policy toward Gaza, which many are describing as being much tougher, in fact, than anything that happened under the Mubarak government. The most recent development being the flooding of the tunnels with sewage, which was certainly never happened under Mubarak. I think that in some ways the approach of the Egyptian government to Sinai shows us the complex set of factors, in some cases moving parts, that are at work during the current period. So that Sinai and Gaza policy illustrates, for example, this uneasy relationship between a powerful entrenched military and a still weak or attempting to consolidate its position civilian leadership. the longstanding antagonism between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood, and what I would argue is an increasing alienation of what I'll call non-religious oppositional forces, I don't like the word secular, from the political process, which mutes what might have been opposition to this Gaza policy from many average Egyptians, because they don't like the relationship with Hamas. There's been a lot in the Egyptian press recently which has been very critical of the Palestinians. So when one thinks of a long-term sort of a pan-Arab or pro-Palestinian sector of the Egyptian opposition, their opposition to things like the flooding of the tunnels and the approach in Sinai is somewhat muted because of the relationship between Hamas and the current government. Now, it is true that during the Israeli assault on Gaza in 2012, that Morsi played a role, a serious mediator, and he was certainly thanked and credited by the U.S. and Hamas for helping to broker a ceasefire. Unfortunately, it seems that the legitimacy or the empowerment that he felt as a result of that then led to his decision, which came almost immediately thereafter, to assume extra constitutional powers, which precipitated what I think was probably the greatest domestic crisis since February of 2011. Now, finally, on Egypt, there are the implications for regional alignments. And here we've seen some changes. Under Mubarak, Saudi Arabia had been a very close ally. Now the relationship has shifted, and it's Qatar, which is the more important partner. Qatar has and is in the process of cultivating a variety of economic relationships, investment, and otherwise. It's made promises of financial aid. It's been directly involved in Gaza. The emir visited Gaza. We also have what is apparently Morsi's greater openness to dealing with Iran, which is a dramatic departure also from the previous regime. But I think it's certainly not the product of mass involvement in Egyptian politics. I think it's more an attempt by Cairo to try and assert a more central or independent role in the region than had been the case in the past, to try and flex a little bit of muscle. But so Morsi attended the non-aligned movement summit in Tehran. But when he did so, in his speech, he criticized the Syrian regime. So it wasn't like he was going there and sort of accepting Tehran's policy in the region. All right, I'll stop with Egypt there, and I'll turn to Jordan. Some of the demonstrations that have taken place in Jordan since spring of 2011 have been organized by the traditional opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood, a variety of pan-Arabists and leftists. They've called for regime reform in general. They've decried corruption. There is still an anti-normalization contingent, which is a part of these demonstrations, and it's not that they haven't voiced their concerns or their opposition, but opposition to the peace treaty has not been a major part of the anti-regime or the demonstrations that have taken place since the beginning of 2011. What's been particularly notable in the Jordanian case instead, I think, is the mobilization of some new sectors, particularly among East Bankers, that is Transjordanians, and especially the young. So what one sees coming from these sectors are increasingly harsh, direct criticisms of the king and calls for not just reform of the government, but bringing down or reform, the regime. So when one has what's called the Hirak, which is sort of the movement, which is a largely East Banker movement, but they've also called for full citizenship and unity of the Jordanian people of all backgrounds, and that's code word that's code language for including Jordanians of Palestinian origin more fully in the politics of the country as we're fully citizen. Now, those kinds of demands are extremely important, but they are domestic. They're not foreign policy related. The centerpiece of the King's reform movement has been the reform of the electoral law, rewriting of electoral law in 2012, and then the holding of elections, which were promised to be clean. It was critical to the king that there be significant registration, and that was to a certain degree problematic because the Muslim Brotherhood had said from the beginning that it would likely boycott the elections. In the end, the regime did secure significant registration so that the elections would appear legitimate. But in the lead up to the elections, and it led to their postponement, there was the lifting of major subsidies, which led to the largest outpouring, I think, of demonstrations since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring. Under those conditions, however, the regime simply held firm. They had tried to lift subsidies earlier in August, and that led to the fall of one prime minister. But this time, the prime minister the king made no statements about the lifting of the subsidies and the outpouring of emotion and so on thereafter. So the government simply refused to back down in the face of this mass opposition. So we had parliamentary elections then in January. A lot of external observers who basically gave it a seal of approval, some problems, but what they saw as an important step, I guess, in the King's reform process, as he's calling it. It's brought to the parliament some new personalities, some of them quite outspoken, but it's not at all clear it's going to make a significant difference in Jordanian policy going forward. There's a much touted new process for choosing a prime minister, which has simply brought us the previous prime minister again. And he's still been unable. I didn't see the news this morning, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that he's still been able to put together a cabinet. And now we're 6 weeks away from the elections. Now, in the foreign policy realm, the striking change in this period, I think, has been the change in the relationship between Egypt and Jordan. And that is because we have in Egypt now a government run by the Muslim Brotherhood, and in Jordan, the Muslim Brotherhood, since the early 1990s, has been the primary opposition force in the kingdom. So this has meant the relationship has been uncomfortable for the Jordanians. The Jordanians had also off and on tried to suppress Hamas, and of course now Hamas has at least some kind of an ally in the Egyptian government, although I guess not when it comes to tunnel smuggling. Tensions have flared over a number of issues, perhaps the most serious one having to do with with the contract between Egypt and Jordan for the supply of natural gas, which the Egyptians were not following through with. It forced Jordan to go into the international market to buy gas at higher prices at a time when the budget simply couldn't sustain that. So in response, as a way of trying to put pressure on the Egyptians, the Jordanians threatened to expel a large number of Egyptian guest workers in the country. So that it seemed initially to have resolved the problem, but this continues to be an issue between the two countries. Farther afield, the traditionally supportive Gulf states have made promises to Jordan of financial assistance since the beginning of the Arab Spring, but not all the commitments have been fulfilled. So it's easy, talking the talk, but not necessarily walking the walk. Qatar was pleased with Jordan's support of its charge against the Gaddafi regime, but it and Saudi Arabia have been less than thrilled with Jordan's role in supporting the efforts to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Now, it's not to say that Jordan hasn't cooperated. It has. It's provided facilities of various sorts. It's provided assistance of various sorts, but apparently not up to the level that the Qataris or the Saudis might have liked. The Qataris are also unhappy with the Jordanians because in this Qatari axis on the one side and the Saudi axis on the other, the Jordanians have really fallen into the Saudi UAE axis in large part because of the Qatari support of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. So at this point, Jordanian concerns about the impact, the overflow, or the possible spillover, I would say, from the civil war in Syria is really what's guiding their approach to the Qatari and Saudi demands on Syria. And while they're trying to be helpful, there are also indications that they've maintained some ties with the Syrians. The Jordanians were badly burned in 1970, after 1970 when the Syrians closed their border. That, the recollection of that is there. And they're the ones who are going to have to live with Syria on their northern border when this is all over. So they're to some degree hedging their bets. Finally, in terms of external relationships, there were reports recently of a possible deal with Russia to build a major weapons production factory in the northern part of the country, along with Russian support for a peaceful Jordanian civilian nuclear program. Now, whether this is serious or whether this is a way of trying to bring to bear some influence on other relationships is not entirely clear. But maybe some of you know. I don't have special intel on this. But in any case, the key military relationship with the United States remains strong. In May 2012, there was this Operation Eager Lion, which was a huge set of exercises among 19 different countries, which 3 years in the planning. We still have the annual Infinite Moonlight set of exercises between the U.S. and Jordanian forces. And then in the fall of 2012, there was the stationing of some 150 American troops in northern Jordan at a base. They've clearly been involved in training Syrian fighters for the Syrian civil war. They're also there to help with issues related to border security, refugee flows, or perhaps securing chemical weapons. So to just sum up, certainly these the revolts, the revolutions, demonstrations have embodied many different kinds of expressions, demands for change on the economic front, the political front, concerns about unemployment, inflation, security, the rule of law, and so on. There have been some shifts in regional alignments, but in terms of external alignments, I think one of the very interesting things that there has been very little change. That in fact the relationship with regard to the peace treaty with both of these countries remains quite strong. The military relationship with the United States remains strong, and even with the proviso of expect the unexpected from my initial anecdote, given the kinds of constraints under which these leaders are operating, I don't at this point see any major modifications, at least in those key aspects of the Egyptian, U.S.-Jordanian relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Steve?
Thank you. Thank you, Hale, for hosting us again, and thank you, Laurie, for stopping off in Washington on a very long trip between Turkey and Southern California to share your thoughts with us. When USIP and the Wilson Center were designing this series on the implications of the Arab Spring for the broader strategic landscape in the region, we knew that this was going to be one of the topics that we would have to handle, that we would have to try to understand how the resurgence or the revival of mass politics mattered for the broader strategic context in the region and for the strategic behavior of the regimes that were emerging in the wake of the mass protests that swept the region beginning in 2011. And yet we also understood that this was going to be a very complicated, very difficult set of relationships and effects to tease out. We understood that many of them might not be fully visible for some time, and so I congratulate Laurie in particular on her willingness to take a stab at unpacking some of the implications of the resurgence of mass politics for this broader strategic transformation that the Arab Spring has brought and is continuing to bring to the region. And I think she does a very good job of unpacking many of the complexities that lie at the heart of this relationship between mass politics on one hand and the regional strategic environment on the other. And one of the things I think that she does particularly well is make clear just how closely the wave of mass protests that we've seen in the region since 2011 have been affected by and intersect with a regional environment, including a regional security environment that looks very, very different from the one in which earlier episodes of mass politics occurred in the region. The First Intifada in the late 1980s, the First Intifada, the Algerian uprising protests in Jordan, were in a very different regional environment at the moment. And one of the critical differences, one that perhaps is not stressed as much in Laurie's paper as I might have stressed it, is the extent to which regional balance of power politics are now increasingly shaped by sectarian tensions, the extent to which the responses to the upsurge in mass politics in many cases, especially among the GCC states, but also Iran, have been heavily influenced by the deepening sectarian polarization across the region, but also by a number of other changes that we might associate with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, whose ripple effects continue to influence the way in which political processes unfold in a variety of settings, including, of course, in the case of Syria. In addition, what I also think Laurie does very well, and in doing so opens up questions that I think deserve far more attention than they have received to date, is highlight what I think has to be seen as one of the critical disconnects or critical disjunctures in the way mass politics have tended to play out in the Arab world in the period since the start of the Arab Spring uprising. And I use that term with as many reservations as Laurie does, but have not yet found a suitable alternative.
Just
but
a shorthand.
A shorthand.
It's fast. That's
but one of these central disconnects, and this disconnect is especially visible, I think, when we look at the countries most deeply affected by the mass uprisings of the past 2 years, Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia. On the one hand, as Laurie points out, what she calls the foot soldiers of these mass uprisings, these spontaneous, often youth-led movements that effectively drove autocrats out of power, have, with very, very few exceptions, played a negligible role in the political processes, in the political transitions that followed their initial success in achieving the overthrow of deeply entrenched autocratic leaders. And it's worth thinking about, and we can discuss more in the Q&A session, why it is that these youth movements, that these spontaneous political movements have been so thoroughly marginalized as politics have shifted from the street into formal political arenas. But what Laurie points out, and I think it highlights possibilities for some significant tensions between these emergent, I won't call them post-authoritarian, we don't know yet, but certainly post-uprising regimes, and these newly mobilized societies, which played an important role in bringing them into power, is that even in the cases in which mass politics were most influential and most effective, and where we might expect that the regimes that were carried into power, often on the backs of these street protests, we've seen, as Laurie stressed, this very high degree of continuity in the ways in which they've managed some of the critical strategic and foreign policy issues that they've confronted, certainly with respect to relationships with Israel, in some instances with respect to the relationships with the United States, in some instances with respect to relationships with international financial institutions. But we've seen this really quite striking degree of continuity on the part of many of these post-Arab Spring regimes. This is certainly far less the case in Libya, for reasons that I think we all understand, where the transition from the Gaddafi regime to what is emerging now would and did bring about the kind of reorientation of foreign policy that I think many anticipated. But in other cases, including those in which protesters were highly critical of the relationships that autocrats had built with the West, where they felt that the strategic dependence of these regimes in Tunisia, in Egypt, for example, on the support of the West was a key indicator of the corruption of those regimes, was a key indicator of the extent to which those regimes had abandoned the aspirations and the interests of their own citizens, that even in those regimes, we have seen this level of continuity that Laurie mentioned. And it should also be stressed that in both the Tunisian and the Egyptian case, these are Islamist. These are regimes led by Islamist political parties that have embraced policies of their predecessors, many of which they had spent decades cultivating very finely tuned critiques of during their years in opposition. And this seems to me to open up really one of the most important questions to arise from Laurie's paper, which is, how do we account for this? I mean, how do we explain this degree of continuity, given the high levels of popular mobilization that we've seen across the region, and given that mobilization often precisely targeted the foreign policy orientations of the old regimes in the protests that led to the overthrow of former elites. And there are, I would think, a number of possible explanations, and I'll just mention a few of them and throw them out there as a starting point for conversation. One is that the continuity demonstrates the limits of mass politics, especially with respect to foreign policy in the Arab world, and that there are really very, very few meaningful constraints on the foreign policy behavior of Arab elites from the street. So that's one possibility to consider. Another is that perhaps the realists have simply won, and that what we're seeing is the triumph of interests over ideology, and that Islamist regimes, newly elected governments, find themselves, now that they are in power, with responsibilities and with constraints that drive them in the direction of the continuation of the policy relationships and orientations of their predecessors. A third is that this is simply an interregnum, that this is a temporary moment, that this is a period in which, as Laurie suggested, many of these regimes are consolidating themselves, they're finding their feet, They do not have established relationships with counterparts in the international system. They are continuing to struggle to secure their positions domestically, and that this is the wrong moment for them to begin making dramatic changes in foreign policy which might impede their interest in securing other objectives, like emergency stabilization loans from the international financial institutions and so on. But that over time, as these regimes become more self-confident, they will in fact demonstrate broader and more dramatic shifts in how they manage foreign policy. We can't tell at this point, I think, which of these three potential explanations may be the more important one. They're not necessarily exclusive, but it does seem to me that whichever of these explanations we might prefer in trying to understand this surprising degree of continuity, we have to recognize that one of its consequences is to create the potential for significant future tensions between regimes and highly mobilized societies who will be looking to their new political leaders to distinguish themselves in the domain of foreign and regional policy from their predecessors, and who may be prepared to find a variety of ways to hold their new leaders accountable for abandoning the commitments that were part of the transformational period in Arab politics in 2011 and 2012 around the kind of reorientations of foreign policy that made these incoming political actors popular, credible, legitimate with their citizens, with their voters. And to the extent that these patterns of continuity take hold, and that the more transformational ambitions in the foreign policy arena of these governments begin to fade, one of the areas I'd want to be paying attention to as a possible source of future tensions between regimes and societies is precisely the gap that we will see becoming more visible and perhaps politically more salient between the transformational claims and ambitions of these new ruling parties and their actual performance in government, and that's an area that I would certainly want to be looking at if I were trying to think about where some of the future drivers might be that could bring people back into the streets at some point and pose challenges to the stability of some of these newly elected regimes. And I think what Laurie's paper has done has given us a very, very useful starting point for beginning to engage some of these questions that I think are going to be quite important for us in the months and the years ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. We'll open the floor now to your questions. Let me ask you a question, and then I'll go to John. In Iran to this day, the government can mobilize substantial mass of the masses, you know. Can any of these leaders of the countries of the Arab Spring count on that? Can they mobilize? Can they bring their supporters out in the streets? Or we haven't seen it.
Well, I mean, I think in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood has demonstrated, maybe not on the same, in the same numbers that is the case with the Iranian regime, but certainly in key moments where there have been threats or perceived threats, challenges, the Muslim Brotherhood has been able to bring people into the street. Blocking, there was one court decision that was supposed to be held down, and basically people were out in front and prevented access to the court, and in a number of other occasions. So it's maybe not the same massive mobilization, but I do think that on key events, and in Cairo in particular, that the Egyptians have been able to do that. With, in the case of Jordan, when you're talking about the supporters of the regime, you're basically talking about mobilizing the security forces to put down demonstrations. So it's not the same kind of mass politics, and it's not the same kind of mobilization, but it is able to get those supporters into the streets because of the sort of longstanding patronage relationships there. Well, I mean, Tunisia, there clearly have continued to be clashes. I mean, I think that's one of the very interesting things too. Just when one thinks that perhaps these people, that people in various areas are sapped of energy, not necessarily, I'm not talking about revolutionary fervor, but that people, these movements and the changes that they've wrought and the economic difficulties that have been exacerbated rather than solved during the course of them have really taken a tremendous toll on these various populations. So, there are many people, I mean, I think I've heard it most often mentioned in the Egyptian case, but I'm sure it exists elsewhere, that people they're exhausted. They want a solution. So that can either lead to a kind of retreat to the home because you don't have the energy, or it can, and in some cases, actually lead then to a renewed outpouring. And I think that one of the things that the last incidents of violence in Boursaid showed is that there is a great deal of unspent, I don't know whether you want to call it revolutionary fervor or not, but the potential for renewed outbreaks of significant violence. And in the case of Boursaid, I mean, people were basically declaring this as this is outside of Morsi's territory. The military wasn't enforcing what Morsi's curfew orders. So there's a lot of energy which is still there and a lot of possibilities for mobilization. And I think we're wrong to think that. I think there are going to be various periods of calm before storms. Ellis Goldberg had, I think, a very interesting piece in I don't know how many of you read the website Jadaliya, but saying this really, for people who were arguing, has there been a revolution in Egypt or not? He said this is a revolution underway. It is a revolutionary moment, and the kinds of things that we're seeing, these various forces coming out, rejecting state power, the establishment of the independent Republic of Mahal al-Kubra in the Delta area, which also took place. I mean, all of these things suggest that that popular mobilization is yet completely spent.
I would only add that I think it's not unusual to find that groups which have very little in common, other than a shared commitment to a broad political objective like the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak or the removal of Ben Ali, once that goal has been achieved, find themselves splintering, find themselves moving not from relationships of cooperation to relationships of conflict. And we've certainly seen that in the Egyptian case. We've seen it to some extent in the Tunisian case as well. And I think what this suggests is that even as these societies remain highly mobilized, that patterns of mass politics are changing. They're changing in ways that are much more difficult for regimes to control, that they are developing internal tensions among mobilized groups that are likely to drive a very high level of street politics, conflictual street politics in the period ahead, but of a much more not disorganized, but certainly less focused kind. And it poses a real challenge for regimes, of course, because, and we see this in Egypt in particular, to the extent that governments try to use the street to advance their own political objectives. They're setting the stage for the continuation of mass protests, of street-level politics, which become partisan in ways that can ultimately prove very, very dangerous for the consolidation of political institutions, of democracy, of stability, and of other conditions that would promote the return to normalcy. And if what we find is that as in Egypt, street politics becomes the modal form of political expression, I think we have to conclude that Egypt is in for a very rough time.
Yeah. John, just wait for the... Yeah.
John Alterman, CSIS. Thanks very much for those presentations. I wanted to pick up on Laurie's point of just how much the Egyptian government in its new form has been helping the United States, and then pick up on Steve's point about maybe this is somewhat inevitable that new governments would help. What does that mean for what U.S. policy should be toward helping the Morsi government consolidate power? Are U.S. interests advanced by having a perhaps imperfect Muslim Brotherhood-led government perhaps create a new authoritarian regime in Egypt? Should the U.S. be indifferent because any future government would still feel a need to maintain this balance and would follow its own political interests, its national interests, and therefore would not be hostile to the United States? Understanding the United States can't determine political outcomes in Egypt, should the desire be to help this government consolidate its power and continue to be a partner for the time being, should the desire be to be indifferent to its political fate, should the desire be to not have a policy? I mean, what's the policy conclusion?
You mean our default approach at the moment? Right? Shut it. I didn't say.
There goes your political appointment, Steve.
Janet, and sure. No, Janet, answer. We take one question at a time.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, see, there's a reason why I'm in the academic world in Los Angeles and you're in the the political, or the policy world in D.C., because academics don't have to come up with answers for those questions. It's part of their, regular job. I mean, it seems to me it also depends on how any given administration defines its interests, right? I mean, what is the goal? Is the goal, and I'm not. I'm not particularly trying to, sort of criticize the Obama administration. I think that it's very difficult when you have these moving targets and where you have had relationships in the past where you've been enormously important in the continuation, the resiliency of authoritarianism, as Jason Brownlee's book, I helped him with that title, which was not defeating democracy. What was it? Now I'm forgetting. But anyway, I mean, the idea that the United States played a major role in keeping Hosni Mubarak in power, and the United States and other European powers in helping to keep Ben Ali in power, is the idea is what is the highest order of interest? Is it stability? Is it the peace treaty, which requires stability, or like I said, I'm glad I'm in academia, and I'm not trying to advise the administration on this, because I think it's very difficult. I know there's a lot of criticism of the U.S. among opposition in Egypt now, because they feel that the U.S. has been too friendly to the Muslim Brotherhood, that the U.S. in the past was critical of it, and yet Morsi comes to power, and so now the U.S. has in effect embraced him and maybe gone too far in which is helping him to consolidate a government and potentially a regime which is not friendly to sort of further participatory development. So I don't have a good answer to your question, John. I'm sorry, I wish I did, but I don't. Steve lives in Washington. He must have answers to these questions.
I wouldn't ever claim to have a good answer, but I'll take a stab at it nonetheless. Look, it seems to me as if the initial response of the administration was to build on what it viewed as a certain level of electoral legitimacy that the Morsi government had secured as a result of its victory at the polls, and to use that as a starting point for overcoming what it recognized was a critical, long-term, adversarial relationship between the U.S. government and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and to do so in a way that it hoped would create opportunities for influence that would temper some of the inclinations of the Ikhwan to govern in ways that the U.S. would prefer to avoid. It does seem to me, and that I think led to a period in which the administration was largely silent as it watched the trajectory of governance under President Morsi move in directions with which it was increasingly uncomfortable. it seems to me that more recently it has shifted ground a bit and has tried to hold out expectations about the weight that the U.S. attaches to democratic processes, procedures, practices, institutions, as critical in its assessment of the behavior of the Morsi government, to benchmark the behavior of the Morsi government against some of those expectations, and to express a somewhat more critical and cautious note in its communications with the Morsi government when it feels that it has departed from those expectations in ways that challenge the relationship between the U.S. and Egypt. I think it continues to be very difficult, though, to imagine the administration pushing further in that direction to the point that it might cause some kind of fundamental rift in the relationship. So it's a bounded. We operate under constraints with respect to the extent to which we can foreground our expectations about what constitutes appropriate practices on the part of the Morsi government, because we know that if we pushed that too far, we would be perhaps undermining the opportunity to have any influence whatsoever. Now, how you strike that balance, how the administration has tried to strike that balance, has in general satisfied no one. There are many who felt it took too long to comment, that it has not been assertive enough in its critique of the Brotherhood. There are others who feel that the U.S. has been appropriate in giving the Egyptian regime some breathing space, and that it is not yet time to conclude that it has lost the legitimacy it acquired as a result of its victory at the polls, and that it's not our business to be directing the affairs of the Egyptian government, and that we should build a relationship which acknowledges that this is not going to be the Egypt that we came to know and love under Hosni Mubarak, and we'll have to live with that. And it seems to me, and John, you're much more in tune with these debates than I am, that this is really one of the critical dividing lines within the administration now about how far to move in either of those two directions. For the time being, it does seem that some of the benefit of the doubt that the Obama administration was prepared to extend to the Morsi government is being withdrawn. And it'll be interesting to see how far they're prepared to move in that direction. I think it will depend a lot on what we see happening in Cairo.
Okay. Janet, we'll move, I know, we just moved to this side and then back to that side.
Thanks so much, Hala. I'm Janet Breslin. I was a former faculty at the National War College here in D.C., but I live in Riyadh. My husband's the U.S. ambassador there. And I want to go back to what Laurie said, her comment in the very beginning about it didn't appear that there's an economic policy that the parties can refer to. And that's something I've been hearing in Riyadh as well, that the parties that assume the majority in Egypt self-identified as Islamic parties. They're acting in the name of Islam, and they campaigned on that. And if they campaigned on the idea that Islam is the answer, there seems to be a searching now for what would be an Islamic theory of macroeconomics in a market economy, and that they're searching for something that would make them distinct, that would reflect the expectations that the voters had for them. And yet there's no foundation, there's no past thought. So I was curious, have you heard of anything in Egypt of scholars looking at that? In Riyadh, I'm beginning to hear it. Some discussion between Islamic scholars and practical economists who have had experience in subsidy issues, fiscal policy, all the things that government's responsible for, to begin to have just a beginning discussion of a macroeconomic response to an Islamic value structure that could be expressed, but having to deal with a market economy, a market that they live in. But I didn't know if you've heard that in Egypt with scholars from the university.
Well, I know that there was at one point under preparation something called the Ennahda program, not to be confused with Ennahda, the party in Tunisia. But then my understanding was that people who had been involved in it sort of defected from the Brotherhood, or they were no longer interested in cooperating, and so they basically took all their papers and went home and didn't share it, and so the discussions have been renewed. I'm not particularly clear on all of the details, but I mean, I think that, look, I mean, Egypt needs loans, and the kinds of loans that it's going to try and achieve are going to come from institutions like the IMF, which have elements of conditionality. And that's unlikely to change. Now, so let me make 2 points. One is that there is a discussion now. In fact, I was just reading about it. It's been in the news in Egypt over the last month or so. You know, as part of the new constitution, requires that Al-Azhar review laws for their being consistent with Sharia. And so the most recent discussion has been about Islamic bonds, this sukuk. And so that there's the unhappiness that the government I guess the Shura Council went ahead and passed this law. It wasn't reviewed by Al-Azhar, and now the Salafist parties are angry that the proper procedure wasn't followed, so they want this reviewed. They also then are talking about the need for Al-Azhar then to review any kinds of loan agreements into which Egypt might enter with the IMF or any other financial institution. Now, what the Constitution doesn't make clear is whether Al-Azhar's review and evaluation of these things would necessarily have to be binding on the government. In other words, Al-Azhar could say, this is not in keeping with Sharia, and they could say, thank you very much, we're still going to sign the agreement. So that's one discussion which is underway, which I think also brings into focus the domestic politics. I mean, there are differences between the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood. There were differences over the role that Al-Azhar should have in the new constitution, and this is all being, coming to the fore in this discussion. But the other thing I think it's really important to mention is that there is, aside from this issue of usury and so on, right? Okay, that's what we all get hung up on. But the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't want to say across the board, but certainly has been known for having members who are business people. I mean, Khair al-Shater is a huge businessman. There are extremely wealthy people who are in the Brotherhood. There is the idea of social justice not carried out by the state, not undertaken by the state, which was that was part of the Nasser contract, right? No, this is social justice which is to be achieved through a redistribution of some sort, but through charity. Mm-hmm. So that the approach of the Brotherhood, the Islamists, is very much in keeping with a neoliberal approach, which says we don't want the state to become involved in these sorts of things. These are issues that should be solved by the Muslim community through elements of charity. And so, I mean, there's no contradiction with neoliberalism on that point at all. So I think that there is the idea that the Brotherhood has a populist appeal, and that many of the people who voted for the Brotherhood did so out of rejection of the kind of economic system under which they were living, and the oppression and the lack of jobs and so on that resulted in for them. If the expectation was that the Brotherhood, whether it's the Muslim, the Ikhwan in Egypt, or whether it's a Nahda in Tunisia or some other franchise elsewhere, is going to bring with it some major reconfiguration of state involvement in the economy, I think that's a misguided sort of expectation. So there can be a lot of thinking about how do we deal with the issue of loans, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the Egyptian case. But I really believe that these are businessmen. And while they have an interest in the implementation of certain aspects of Sharia and certain elements of sort of broader conservatism in society, I therefore don't think these are not progressives. I mean, these are not people to whom one looks for, I think, for any kind of a progressive economic program. And I wouldn't expect any of the discussions that are taking place to produce anything like that, at least given the configuration of forces that I see now.
I think Laurie's covered the ground very well on that. Just a couple of quick points. One is that this is another domain in which popular expectations about what these new governments would deliver with respect to social welfare, social provision, excuse me, redistributive programs, public spending, is likely to become another axis of tension between state and society, as it becomes clear precisely how these notions of charity, self-help, social justice are translated into policy by new Islamist governments. There is a bit of work out there on the subject. Ibrahim Saif, a Jordanian economist who's with the Carnegie Endowment office in Beirut, has published a paper on the economic platforms of Islamist parties. A colleague based in Europe, Eberhard Kinley, is just finishing a manuscript in which he does very careful kind of line-by-line review of the economic platforms produced by the Egyptian Brotherhood and by Ennahda. That's not, it's in draft. It should appear soon in a journal called Critique Internationale. But there is some material out there in which people have tried to take stock of precisely what the platforms of these new parties have been and how those might translate into public policy. So it isn't, there is some stuff out there that's probably worth consulting.
Gentleman here. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Michael Albin. I'm an independent researcher. I was wondering about the prominent role Qatar seems to be playing, not only in Egypt, but throughout the Arab region. What's in it for them, and what are the implications for mass movements, to try to keep us within the framework of the discussion today? Is their penetration ideological and financial at a high level of investment and influence, or does it penetrate into individual investment into real estate, for example, or tourism investment, or how is this going on? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think Qatar's first foray into exerting greater regional influence, of course, was the establishment of Al Jazeera, right? As one Lebanese author called it once, l'État nation, l'État télévision. And so, I mean, this was the amount of, for such a small place, although obviously financially quite powerful, Al Jazeera gave it influence well beyond its size or I think its financial capabilities at that point. And it was part of an attempt to exert greater regional influence in the context of a region where obviously the Saudis were the most sort of financially powerful. What could Qatar offer? Well, it could offer this, and it was tremendously valuable for it. Of course, Al Jazeera has shifted its role, I think, significantly since the beginning of the Arab Spring, and it's I think become much less interesting. Although if one wants to follow sort of active advocacy, it's certainly perhaps an important case study. But the Qataris have they've taken advantage of these openings that the Arabs that have come with these uprisings, and they have put their money into supporting the money and political influence into supporting basic Muslim Brotherhood groups around the region, and so that gives them greater political influence. The kind of investment that they're talking about for Egypt, I mean, it runs the gamut of things, everything from tourism to. So there are apparently attempts underway to perhaps oust the UAE from investments around the Canal Zone, and so there's all. What's in it for them? I mean, the Qataris have engaged in all sorts of public diplomacy as well by hosting various games. They've got the World Cup coming. They want to be. The Emir clearly wants to be a major actor, and he's putting his significant financial resources to work to try and achieve that, and has secured a central place for himself in one of the two major axes. If you don't count sort of Iran, Syria as a major axis, but between the Saudis on the one hand and the Qataris on the other, and there, historically there have been rivalries between the Saudis and the Qataris. There was a period when that sort of rivalry diminished somewhat. I think it's a bit clearer now with the outbreak of the Arab Spring. But this is part of sort of shifting regional alliances. I mean, to the extent that it's ideological, it's the choice of the Muslim Brotherhood and its related institutions that it's funding. But I don't know if you have.
No, I think there's been a deeply instrumental, deeply strategic pattern of engagement by the Qataris in Arab Spring politics, and that they have warmly embraced mass politics, where they felt that popular uprisings created opportunities for them to deepen their influence and to expand the authority and the influence of the various Muslim Brotherhood movements, of which they have been a principal sponsor. Where they have felt less sanguine about mass politics, they've been very clear about the risks posed and been prepared to take steps to clamp down. And I think beyond that, Laurie, you sort of framed the issues quite well. I won't add any more than that.
The lady here, yes.
Evelyn Early, independent anthropologist. I would like to hear what both of you have to say a bit more about the Jordanian king. You noted quite correctly that he has a lot to lose, a lot more than any other country from the Gulf. I was fascinated that in his press conference with President Obama, he was asked what would happen if Syria totally fell apart, no electricity and so on, would he keep the borders open? And he said yes, he would never turn away a woman or child needing to come across the border. Somewhere in some other interview, he also said that Morsi was out of his depth. How would the two of you assess what he's doing now, his strategies, his ability to be a player in all of the various changing coalitions?
Well, he's great on Jon Stewart. Yeah, I mean, I think the the piece that was in The Atlantic that Jeffrey Goldberg did is revelatory of so much that's very important about the king. He plays really well here in Washington and in other Western capitals, not nearly so well back home. I think that I think there's a great deal of tremendous dishonesty in that particular interview, to present himself as the person who's interested in reform, who's interested in trying to transform this, system of dinosaurs where everything is patronage based and so on. I mean, this is a monarch who is there because of who his father is. He's not there because of merit. And so it seems to me that that's sort of the most basic corrupt aspect of rule that one can talk about in the regime. And for him also to suggest that he is somehow or other the victim of forces that are conservative, which he is not supportive of, when so much of what happens in the regime in terms of politics in Jordan takes place behind closed doors, where there have been the recent electoral law was certainly not nearly what people had hoped for in terms of change. Recent clampdowns on press and so on internet. I mean, these are all happening under his watch. And so the idea that somehow or other he's the one who's sort of this martyr in the cause of reform, and he's up against just these insurmountable odds of everybody around him, I think is completely disingenuous and just not accurate. So he and keeping the border open for Syrians, yes. I mean, I think there, on the one hand, on a popular level in Jordan, there's a great deal of concern and support for the idea of giving refuge to people. I mean, Jordan it's nothing if it's not a receptacle for refugees. But I think there's also an instrumental angle to it, which is the deep hope that each Syrian refugee is going to bring some additional dollars to the kingdom, so this so-called reform process to me doesn't. I'm not impressed. I don't find it serious. I don't find him serious in his approach. I think this expression in Arabic again, مش قد المقام. I think he's demonstrated certainly in sort of the imprudence and the material that he mentioned in that interview, that this is not something that one expects from a world leader, and it was very, I think, it was shocking. And I think, demonstrates that there is, aside from platitudes, which I assume somebody here in Washington is writing for him, about how you need left, right, and center, and sort of I don't think he has a clear vision of reform, and he mentioned in the interview that he thought about, stepping down, abdicating 10 years ago. He could have done it.
Yeah, it was, it's always great fun to hear an Arab head of state dissing his counterparts. But just on the question of the openness and tolerance of refugees, I don't think we should attach terribly much weight to those statements from the king. A small story I recall, I was in Cairo in early July 2012 when the Arab League had convened a major meeting of the Syrian opposition. And the Turkish Foreign Minister, Ahmet Davutoglu, gave one of the keynote speeches at that conference. And he said that Turkey's borders will always be open to our Syrian brothers, whether you come in the thousands, the tens of thousands, the 100,000s, or the millions. We will never shut our borders to you. You will always be welcome in Turkey. Yeah, that did not turn out to be an accurate characterization of Turkish policy. Right now, I just heard this statistic recently, 7% of Jordan's population consists of Syrian refugees. I think there is enormous fear about the possibility that if the conflict in the south spreads, if it becomes, if the conditions in Sueda in particular and other large cities, the capital of the Druze area of southern Syria, if that becomes destabilized, that we could see inflows of an additional 1 million or 2 million Syrian refugees into northern Jordan. There is absolutely no way in the world that their presence will be welcomed by the Jordanian government, and I'm afraid perhaps by Jordanian society as well. As it is right now, conditions in the major refugee camp in Jordan outside of Mafraq in the north are among the worst that Syrian refugees have to contend with. So let's treat that particular comment with a very large grain of salt.
Lady in red, please. Yes. Yeah. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Rachel Peterson. I'm with Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain. Thank you. This panel is fabulous. I would love to hear your thoughts on countries such as Bahrain that have not transitioned fully into new governments, that are still struggling to, obtain their goals, and hear what you have to say about the roles of mass politics there, particularly between the government that's saying one line and then protesters that are saying another line. How do you see the relationship between the two working out, and how do you see U.S. foreign policy fitting into this big picture?
Well, and I think in terms of U.S. policy, Steve, I think, presented eloquently the sort of the unfolding of policy on Egypt. If there is, the response in Bahrain or lack of response was really, I think, dreadful and very late to the game, and for understandable strategic reasons. One of the things that, I don't know if it's in the bio, I chair the Middle East Studies Association's Committee on Academic Freedom, and so we followed very closely the situation of the academic community in Bahrain, and have been. In fact, we gave our Academic Freedom Award last year to the Bahrainis a year ago, to the Bahrainis because of their steadfastness against, in the face of sort of a horrible regime violence and repression. I don't want to say any of these situations is hopeless, because I think that one never wants to believe that, but just given the constellation of forces as they are now, the possibility of any significant reform in Bahrain seems a long shot to me. Having said that, I'm not an expert on Bahrain, nor am I an expert on Saudi Arabia. So the Gulf area is the part of the larger region that I'm least familiar with. But the demands don't go away. There have been this is perhaps the most intense period of anti-regime activity, or this that I'm following. And spring 2011 was, with a diminution, and then apparent, periodic resurgences. But I simply don't see now the possibility for major significant reform or change. But again, I would leave it to people who know Bahrain better than I to comment.
Well, as you may know, Rich, the USIP has been struggling to try to figure out whether there might be opportunities for us to engage in some productive way in Bahrain. And certainly the intensity of the polarization between the government and the opposition is a significant obstacle to developing strategies for finding and strengthening common ground. I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is the extraordinary scale of mass politics that exploded in Bahrain in February 2011. Protests numbering in the hundreds of thousands in a country whose total population is 1.3 million. It's important to keep in mind as well the extent to which the response to mass politics was both profoundly sectarian and also deeply militarized. The extent to which the trajectory of protest has tended to marginalize moderates, to diminish their credibility as potential interlocutors between protesters and the regime, and to bring to the fore movements like April 14, which have pursued a much more radical agenda in their own activities in the streets. There is still, I think, some hope in that the regime is over time perhaps willing to engage with moderate elements of the opposition, the leading political societies, al-Wafaq, and others, to try to carve out a pathway that would lead towards some sort of social reconciliation and perhaps even political reform. There is a national dialogue underway at the moment, which is notable only for the degree of cynicism with which every single member in it is participating. But nonetheless, I think it reflects the importance that the government now attaches to trying to find venues other than the street in which Bahrain's political issues can be discussed. I don't hold out very much hope for the national dialogue. I think that within that context, the U.S. has been strongly encouraging both the government and the opposition to take those kinds of frameworks more seriously. And it has pushed the Bahraini government to do so to an extent that I think has led to some significant frictions between Washington and Manama on precisely this question of what to do about the growing radicalization of the Shia street in Bahrain, and the problem of political reform. But I have to say that I tend to view the current dialogue, as I noted, as having only very limited prospects of achieving meaningful outcomes, and it seems to me that the likely result is the continuation and, in fact, the increasing radicalization of what we might call mass politics in Bahrain at some further cost to the leading political societies, which have in fact over recent months shown themselves to be quite responsive to the concerns of the government. They issued a joint statement, six of them, either five or six of the leading political societies issued a statement denouncing violence in November as a way of clearing the path for dialogue. So even while both moderate opposition and regime with strong U.S. support continue to look for opportunities to move, to advance a project of political reform that is not driven by the street, I find it hard to envision a context in which those kinds of politics, that form of mass politics, is not going to continue to be quite relevant in the Bahraini context.
Thank you very much. We are just going to take one last question here. Yeah, just wait for the mic because we have run out of time. Brief question, please.
Ryan Zito of Syracuse University. As someone who worked with the UNDP this summer in Bahrain on national reconciliation, I might be a little more, have a little more rosy outlook than presented. But my question is on that point, but also in a broader context of has the Sunni community and the Shia community experienced this mass politics in different ways? And what does that say about a possible future? Thank you.
You're talking about specifically Bahrain?
Bahrain,
No,
yeah.
I meant
yeah.
the region generally, in Sunni and Shia, and how they experienced these uprisings differently.
I think we can look at a number of cases in which Sunni and Shia communities are present. Saudi Arabia is one. Certainly, they have experienced the mass uprisings of the Arab Spring quite differently. I think we can look at the regionalization of the Syrian conflict and the extent to which that is sharpening sectarian polarization along lines that tend to forge coalitions among Shia Alawi communities on one hand and Sunni communities on the other, as another instance in which these communities have experienced the uprisings quite differently. And we have the case of Bahrain, where these are dramatically different experiences of what the Arab Spring has meant, although there are, of course, Sunnis within Bahrain who support the overall objectives of the protesters. It's a very different context in North Africa. You know, it's a context where you have far less religious heterogeneity, at least sectarian heterogeneity, and where I think the kinds of divisions and tensions that have shaped the politics of the Arab Spring have far less to do with these sorts of sectarian divisions than with other issues, which is not to say that the Sunni community is monolithic, not at all, but that differences and conflicts, tensions that emerge within that community tend to play out in a very different form than those that are defined in terms of intersectarian conflict in other parts of the region.
The only thing I would add is that even before the so-called Arab Spring, some regimes in North Africa, certainly Algeria was one, would raise the specter of conversion of people, that there were Shiite proselytizers at work as a way of, I don't know, trying to distract people's attention from other more pressing issues. But the one question that, I mean, I'm not a big fan of talking in sectarian terms. I'm not saying that, but I understand the relevance here. And there's also the differential impact on various Christian communities in the region also. So thinking about Syria in particular, and then also thinking about Egypt, and the degree of involvement, the element of class that's involved, the element of region that's involved, and so on. It's also just an important piece of that sort of larger set of different confessional backgrounds and how they were affected by the uprising. I don't go any
And as we are meeting on Good Friday, it's only appropriate that we...
Exactly. Thank you very much. We have run out of time. No, thank you. I'm sorry, we have run out of time. And I'm sorry, we have run out of time. You can ask the speaker after the meeting is over. Please don't forget to pick up our upcoming meetings announcement and the presentation by Laurie. Thank you very much. Thank you for this. Very good. An hour and a half.